Good afternoon, class. I'm getting ready to start our lecture together on the reign of King Edward the First, and I've got my notes in front of me, lots of good stuff ahead of us. Thank you for reading through the material that I provided for you last time, and I hope you have read the chapter in your textbook by Professor Fraser on King Edward. I think he is one of England's most exciting and dynamic monarchs, particularly of this late medieval period, eclipsed only probably by Henry V. Edward III is very exciting too, but Edward I is such a character, cut in the cloth intentionally of King Arthur, as you've read in your textbook. As a matter of fact, he is enamored with this historical. And they see Arthur as a historical figure, as opposed to a literary figure. And more literature is abounding from this generation forward about King Arthur. But Edward is mesmerized and really wants to pattern himself and his reign after what he knows of King Arthur, and again, considering him an historical character. So Edward the First is so named. He is the first, even though you see with justice, we've had Edward the Confessor, Edward the Elder, all of these E's. Well, this is Edward the First of the Plantagenet line, and your textbook explains that pretty forthrightly. His father thought Edward the Confessor, after whom he seemed to pattern himself, and we're speaking, of course, of Henry III. Henry III, to me, seemed much more like Edward the Confessor than anyone else, and he, in fact, named his son Edward after the Confessor. But our Edward I, Longshanks, as he came to be known, was nothing like the Confessor. But having said that, I think he was an able and noble king, fierce, temperamental, but a man of vision, a man of bravery, and I think near and dear to my heart that, and you will see this, a man who had a marvelous marriage. After his first wife Eleanor died, he marries again, and again a second wonderful marriage. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the close of this lecture. If I go too long, what I may do is divide this up into two parts, so we'll see how we can get through it. I've got my notes with me because I'm sure I'll ramble on if I'm not careful more than usual, and there's a lot of detail to cover. And again, I hope you've read this section in your textbook because she does a great job in discussing, I think, the high points of his reign. You could write a textbook on the reign of Edward I, an entire book. One thing I want to say about Professor Fraser's book, and if I've said this before, forgive me. I probably have, and I know I have in other contexts. But as a female historian, I hope you appreciate the fact that she is very even-handed. It's not a feminist history. It is not a women's history. It is a history. And that's why those of us who are female within this profession, we need to remember our task is to be historians, not to just tell one side of the story. And she does a great job with that, I think. It's she's just marvelous, and I hope you're enjoying it. I do also believe that she is a Christian. I see some tenderness and some uh, more than even-handedness in dealing with the Christian motives of some of these monarchs, and you've seen that from the beginning of the book, I hope. All right, let's look at the life of King Edward. As you all know, hopefully from your reading, he was a great help to his father, King Henry III. He himself was kidnapped when his father was by the terrible forces of Simon de Montfort, and manages to effect an escape and overthrows the rebellion against his father. He is a brave and noble figure. And at the time of his father's death, our Prince Edward at that time, and he didn't typically take that title, but Edward was at that time engaging in the Ninth Crusade. Now, some textbooks refer to this as the Seventh Crusade because they simply reckon the Crusades in a different, counting them differently. But the Ninth Crusade was one of the very last, and it was actually much more successful than anyone gives it credit for. And after the Crusades had fallen apart, you all know this, they absolutely fall apart. After Richard the Lionheart and the Third Crusade, it's all downhill from there. But Edward actually has led this crusade to the Holy Land and experiences some success. And he leaves to return home, and he takes a leisurely trip home. He knows his father has died, and he takes a leisurely trip home. And I wrote in my notes, and I was looking over this, that I believe that it takes him 2 years to get home, and that's longer than it should have taken. But it takes him that long to get home, and almost could be he's from the South. He's moseying on home. He trusted England, and England trusted him. He doesn't feel that he has to get home lickety split to make sure that there's not going to be another Barons' War, a third Barons' War. He feels that he can trust England and things will be okay, and he'll get there. And it's a marvelous story. And I don't want you to think for an instant that this king has no trouble. He will have trouble. He'll have some of the same troubles that his father had with the barons. He's still going to work at carving out this concept of parliament that we saw his father begin. And he's going to have trouble all around with Wales, with Scotland, and with France. I mean, who doesn't have trouble with France? So we're going to see this play out. This is not he certainly doesn't have a reign like Edward the Confessor. He doesn't have a reign like his father wanted to have, where you're free from these kind of difficulties, where you let everybody come in and let's all be friends. He has a lot of trouble, but he is the man for it. He's the man of the age, and very much to the purpose of England, I think. And again, he to my mind, he's another one of these kings who is very much a king of England. Not a Norman, not an Angevin, not someone who's here trying to figure out, how many of his French relatives he can bring in. He is a king of England. And I think you'll have a sense of that. Now, he's a bit imperious. No, he's very imperious. He's very, he thinks he's the man of what you and I even or perceive as the United Kingdom. He's the man, and he wants to reclaim some of the French lands that he still had a small English foothold in. So we'll talk about that too. He thinks he's the man, but he sees himself as a king of England. And to me, that is a marvelous thing. That is a marvelous thing. Let me give you a little list of things that I have in my notes that I want you to get. And the beauty of this format is when you've had enough, you can turn me off for a while. You can back me up. You could probably slow it down a little bit. But let me give you a little introduction to him. First of all, I think he is a courageous warrior, in many ways cut in the cloth of not only our concept of Arthur, but really of Richard the Lionheart as well, in the sense of bravery. He's the first on the battlefield. He charges right in where, angels fear to tread. But he also he differs from Richard in that he wanted to be back home, and he wants to rule as the sovereign of England, as opposed to just using England as his collateral to keep crusading. So there's a difference there, but he is very much on the battlefield in ferocity and bravery, like Richard the Lionheart. He was chivalrous, and chivalry is a beautiful word, a beautiful concept, and it's more than holding the door open for a lady. It is really a sense of personal honor and valor. Death before bravery. You would die before you would be cowardly. You do the right thing for church and for country, for those that are weaker than you. And that sounds like that might be a little bit at odds with someone who is a crusader and who is an imperious warrior all along his borders. But to his mind, they fit in rather well. And again, I think too, it also reflects his vision of himself as king of all of England, not just not just the knights, not just those with money, but the king for everyone. So um, I think he's a wonderful person for one of your biographical sketches if you're still looking for people. and I think it would be a really interesting juxtaposition looking at himself compared to Arthur. So, all right, and let me keep going. Sorry. He was taller than almost anyone in the kingdom. His nickname was Longshanks, which typically referred to the length of his legs. He was very long-legged, but he also was very long in his arms, and that helped with his bowmanship, which of course the English turned into a science and an art. So he's every bit a physical match to his personality. It's amazing. He was very dark haired, but it turned it's like Snow White relatively early in his life. You'll see some medieval art where he looks kind of reddish hair. I don't. That's not in the written record. That's just perhaps the way the artist saw him. But when his hair turned white, it made him even more impressive and physically distinctive. This white head of hair. He was a master of swordsmanship and jousting, very comfortable on horseback. Uh, the heavy swords were nothing to him. And again, it goes with that physical strength that went along with his size. Um, and, he was raised in this. He was raised in this. His father was not a warrior, but he was raised to wield his sword for his father and for his country. So he starts at this at a very early age. He inherited from his father sort of a droopy eyelids, and you see that depicted in some of the art. And he also inherited his father Henry III's temper. And Henry III had a bad temper. I don't think he flew into murderous rages, but he could get really angry. But our good King Edward could scare people literally to death. And there is a story out there that he did scare one poor soul in the church to death who was talking to him about church taxes. So I don't know if that's legend or what, but his temper was very ferocious. He had, I wrote this in my notes, and this is my opinion. This is my opinion, but I think it's borne out by the historical record. He had a profound personal respect for both the law, the rule and the role of law. And we could talk about that all day. The rule of law being the law, everyone is subject to it, and the role of law being the power of law to keep social order and to be foundational in a kingdom. He respects the rule and the role of law profoundly, and the role of government. And you're going to see, and Professor Fraser talks about this in your textbook, you're going to see him flesh out a little more fully the concept and the role of Parliament. And the fact that Parliament is not just a group of magnates, it's not just a group of barons. And let me just, I went to a word there, let me mention to you, you'll see this in your reading. I've described to you all barons as landholders. A baron is actually a title, like I think it goes Duke, Marquess, or I used to say Marquis, but Duke, Marquess, Earl, Baron, and Knight. I think is the order. Uh, but Baron can also be a title for any landholder, any title holder, any aristocracy. A magnate um, could be a great man of wealth, a great man of political power, a great man of title, but it's someone that has power. So you'll see that in your writing. The magnates, the barons, the baronial wars. These are wars of powerful men who don't necessarily want to subject themselves to the king's power without some give and take. So just a little verbiage out there for you. But all that to go back and say that I think that Edward had a great respect for the law, for the role of law, for the rule of law, and for the role of government. Um, I think, and you all know my leaning in this direction, he did a lot to codify the English law. we've talked before about judge-made law, the common law, and that's the rich one. I think the richest part of the English legal tradition is the common law. All of these judicial decisions that guide statutory law, that guide how principles are applied in legal decision making. But he's one that Edward seemed to value codification. And I think and that's a codified law is burglary is defined by this. Speeding is defined this way, where they're absolute black and white legal principles, as opposed to the circumstances of a case. That's common law versus statutory law or legal codes. And I think the French tradition tends to be more towards the codification. And he's actually saying there's something to that. Let's bring some law, let's bring a little more certainty into um, the English law by codifying it. And he does that, and it's actually good. I think it fleshes out the English legal tradition and gives them, I think, a more sophisticated body of law in totem altogether. And for that, I mean, to be mindful of that, to be someone who wield his sword against infidels and then come back home and talk about how to better make our English courts work. I mean, there's someone that's a well rounded character. So he is someone who is very much interested in English law, and that richness of the English tradition continues to flourish under his reign. And I'm telling you, I don't see him as someone who wants to rewrite laws or restructure law so that he gets a greater share of power. I believe he wants to invest in English legal tradition as a way of strengthening the nation. He is the King of England. And I keep coming back to that. And here is another way that is represented. And please read in your text, if you would, about that. She talks. Professor Fraser talks a lot about that, and much better than I'm doing in our brief time together. Before we get to the good stuff about Edward and his family life, I want to begin our look at some of the difficulties that Edward is going to face. The wars of Edward. Edward is going to have difficulty with Wales, difficulty with Scotland, for which he is most noted, and Bryce, I know you've been looking forward to this, and difficulty with France. Like everybody has difficulty with France. Well, he is too. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I think things were the easiest for him in dealing with the Welsh, and that says something for him. Nobody has an easy time dealing with the Welsh. And who are the Welsh? The Welsh are the Celtic people that when the Angles and the Saxons were coming in, they fled. Remember when you had these terrible invasions, some of these first post-Roman Britain invasions, and you have these brutal attacks. And I told you everybody that didn't leave was probably killed. And you had a lot of the Celts, the Romano Celts, and they have fled to the outer territories, what we all think of now as Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. They have fled there and tried to uh, survive. So you have these Celtic populations in these three outlying areas of Britannia, and they have taken on their own nationhood or their own, well, that's a little premature, isn't it? They've taken on their own identity, perhaps, and they'll make some claims to their own monarchy. They have their own unique relationships with the church, and they see all these layers of culture in England as, one invader after another, and who are they to tell us what to do? And Wales is always an outpost of difficulty. And you say, Miss Justice, why? Well, there's an easy answer. They're Celtic. They're wild. They are not going to be tamed by Normans. They are not going to be tamed by these pretendy English kings. No, no, no. But uh, they will be tamed. They will be tamed. William the Conqueror has some luck, but even he knew that to keep the Welsh at bay, he had to build these formidable, and we've talked about these castle structures along the border. Subsequent kings will have these Welsh march armies who will basically patrol the border to keep the Welshmen at bay. And you have this new English king who says, um, this relationship is going to change. Now, I have put this, I don't expect you to know how to spell this. It looks like it's Llewellyn, but it's pronounced Llewellyn. There is a Welsh prince, Llewellyn, who decides he wants to pick a fight with our English king. And in 1277, Prince Llewellyn of Wales decides that he is not going to pay homage to King Edward. And what that means is he's not going to recognize him as a liege king. He is not going to recognize Edward as really his sovereign for whom he is a vassal state. No thanks, I'm not going to do that. Well, that doesn't go over very well with our king. And Edward marches an army into Wales, and all of a sudden, Llewellyn changes his mind. Yes, you are my liege king. Thanks for reminding me. In 1282, however, Llewellyn is feeling his oats again and will, in fact, lead a rebellion against Edward's rule. And Edward goes back in with a large army. Llewellyn and his brother are both killed, and the ensuing battles is terrible. There's quite a bit of gruesomeness to the end of these brothers, but the Prince of Wales no longer existed. And Edward called Prince Llewellyn Llewellyn the Last. And in the Treaty of Rhuddlan, and it looks like Rhuddlan, but I think it's actually Redlan, Rhuddlan. It looks like Rhuddlan to us, but in the Treaty of Redlan, this is a castle structure that's built on the Welsh border, and this is one of many castles that Edward is going to festoon the border with. But here he's going to sign this document saying, basically, Wales is now an English principality. You belong to us. And my oldest son, the king's oldest son, will forthwith be the Prince of Wales. So the oldest son of the monarch continues to be the Prince of Wales. So Prince Charles today is the Prince of Wales. If he becomes king, and I hope I hope he does. Unfortunately, you have to say, well, that would mean the death of Elizabeth. I hardly see her retiring. But if and when he becomes King of England, when Charles becomes King of England, his title as Prince of Wales will then be conferred upon Prince William, who is now, I think, the Duke of Cambridge. So this is a title that is established, the Prince of Wales, his title is established because Edward manages to completely subdue, if anybody can subdue, the Welsh. And it becomes, not the most comfortable of relationships, but I think the Welsh are actually going to be easier to deal with than the Scots. So there's a lot of really interesting stories here about Wales, about the title. The title of Prince of Wales, the castle at Rhuddlan. Llewellyn himself is a foolish man, but an interesting character too. So, all right, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to pause here and end this video. It's about 25 minutes. When I come back on the second video, I will talk about Edward and the Scots, which will be much more interesting to you all, I think, and it'll be familiar to you. You have to go off now and watch Braveheart. So I hope you're having a good day, and I'll talk to you again in a few minutes.